Don't look so worried. It'll be fun. Once we get there and set up the tents, you can spend the rest of the day lying in the sun with Louise and Sandy, gossiping about your TV shows and sipping pina coladas from plastic cups. Mike stuffed the foil bags of pina colada cocktail mix down deep in his backpack. Joe said he would bring some rum and Adam was taking care of the beers. Mike and Amber's contributions were the cocktail mix, a bottle of wine, and peanuts and pretzels for snacks. They planned to spend 2 nights in the forest, somewhere secluded but within sight of the river, and Mike had been looking forward to it all week. Camping isn't really my thing. You know that. The hard, lumpy ground, the biting bugs, poison ivy, nowhere to pee except behind a bush. You guys should go on your own. The girls and I could hang out here for the weekend. Amber waved her hand towards the house and the pale gray shadows of the early morning backyard. You have to come. It'll be fun with all of us along, and anyway, it's character building. We can sing around the campfire and toast marshmallows, pretend that we're Boy Scouts again. He patted her on the rear as he walked past to grab the lamp from the garage shelf. They had packed almost everything they needed now, and they were due to meet the others in the parking lot by the Highway 23 exit in just over an hour. I was never a Boy Scout, she grumped. I wasn't even a Girl Scout. See? Do you understand me yet? I told you I've never liked this kind of stuff. It's a good time to learn then. You're never too old for a few life lessons. And no, he wasn't sure if he'd ever understand her. He picked up the lamp and grabbed the hank of rope from the shelf behind it for good measure. Rope would always come in handy somewhere along the line. Every roofer knew that. Amber tested the weight of the backpack she would be carrying, lifting it a few inches off the ground and grimacing. This is really heavy. It won't be too bad once the weight is distributed evenly between your shoulders. He ignored her protests as he helped her slip the straps over her arms. See? Take a test walk. He stood back and admired the sight of her slim brown legs and purred bottom and her cutoffs as she grudgingly made her way across the garage floor. It's not so bad, is it? She refused to agree with him. How far do we have to walk? As far as we need to. Joe has a spot in mind, but I don't know how far it is from the parking bay. I guess it's not too far. That was probably a lie. Great fishing spots were seldom easy to reach, but there was no way he'd be able to coax her into the SUV if he told her they had a 5-mile hike ahead of them once they parked up. How's that backpack feeling now? Comfortable? She wriggled her shoulders. Not too bad, but something is sticking into my lower back. He adjusted the backpack for her, moving the flashlight down further into the bag where it wouldn't bother her. He kissed her fondly on the back of her neck. Thanks for doing this for me. She looked over her shoulder and threw him a grudging glance that was almost but not quite a tease. You owe me one. Unfortunately, her lighter mood didn't last. She raged at him in the car on the way there, frightened and irritated when he changed lanes without giving enough notice to the car behind. Yes, he was in the wrong, and yes, he should have taken more care, but her shouting didn't help matters. He gripped the wheel tightly and stared straight ahead, concentrating on the road in front and listening to her loud, annoyed breathing from the seat beside him. Can I drive? Sure. He pulled over, unwilling to argue. She was so different from this when she was at work, so much kinder and more empathetic when she was dealing with sick or injured people. It was all lovey and honey then, with plenty of solicitous looks and concerned smiles. He'd seen her in work mode once, when he went to meet her after her shift and one of the nurses had let him wait through the back until she was done. He'd been amazed that this caring, patient person was his own beloved but often fractious Amber. What are you thinking about? She asked, finally breaking her silence when they were several miles further up the highway. He gave her a careful smile, unsure if this was an olive branch or a trick. I was thinking about you. She scoffed and rolled her eyes. Sure you were. He allowed the silence to settle again for a few minutes before speaking, keeping his tone jovial to avoid setting her off again. Nearly there. Hopefully we don't have to wait too long for Louise and Joe. Louise and Joe were rarely on time for anything, or not for as long as he'd known them. The team of Louise and Joe came as a set and a non-negotiable extra, attached firmly to Amber by the bonds of a long friendship. Not that he minded. He liked Joe, and Louise wasn't too bad either. Amber yawned loudly as she fiddled with the radio dial. Are you sure you don't know how far we have to walk before we get to the campsite? I'm ready for a nap and we haven't even started yet. No idea. Joe's the one with all the knowledge about that. A friend of his has given him directions to a campsite. They'd nearly reached the turnoff, and from here it was less than 5 minutes to the meeting place, one of the many access points to the national park but not as popular as the reserves that included a picnic area and public toilets. I guess we'll find out soon enough. She surprised him by reaching out and laying her hand on his thigh, high enough for it to be suggestive. Nice. He laid his hand over top of hers to keep it there and smiled across at her. This will be good for both of us. You know you've been working too hard lately. Yeah. Hard. She inched her fingers closer to the jackpot, seductively stroking the inside of his thigh, and he felt himself respond. We should make sure to set up our tent out of earshot of the others. He laughed out loud then, pleased to have her back at her best. He swiftly leaned over to plant a kiss on her lips, covering her mouth and silencing her before she could scold him for taking his eyes off the road again. He gave her another cheeky grin as he swung himself back into his seat. You can count on it. Adam and Sandy aren't here yet. There's Joe's truck. I can't believe they're the first ones here. Amber pointed to the sole vehicle in the gravel-covered parking lot as Mike drove in. I hope we're not waiting too long for them to arrive. I just want to get the walking part over and done with and relax. They're probably not far away, and there's nothing to stop you from relaxing anytime you feel like it. We're out in the wonders of nature now, far away from the stresses of everyday life. Anyway, someone always has to be the last one to arrive, and it could have just as easily been us. Mike nosed the SUV in next to Joe's truck and waved through the windscreen at Louise, who was sitting on one of the low, rounded log guardrails that circled the perimeter of the parking lot. A faded Smokey the Bear You Can Help Prevent Forest Fires sign reared up behind her head. She grinned goofily back at them and flapped her hand at the wrist in a loose, silly wave. Amber didn't bother replying to his comment. Her previous flirtatious mood had evaporated already, and the smile on her lips had been replaced with a sullen pout. Mike left her to it. She could pull herself out of her fog on her own this time. He was ready for his weekend away and more than ready to enjoy himself. As a fully functioning adult, Amber had the choice to do the same, but whether she took that choice was up to her. You might as well try to pound water in a mortar. One of his grandfather's favorite sayings came to mind as Mike climbed out of the car. What would Granddad Pete think of the woman he'd chosen as his wife if he was still around to meet her? Probably not much, unfortunately. Granddad Peter was a pragmatic, hard-working man who didn't have much time for other people's moodiness. His own wife, Grandma Betty, was a stout, laughing woman who never raised her voice at anyone and was the perfect foil for her husband's practical, serious nature. You made it. Joe grinned at him as he hauled two faded, well-used backpacks out of the tray of his truck. Great day for it. It is a great day for it. Mike rolled his neck and wriggled his shoulders, enjoying the warmth of the sun through his t-shirt. He heard Amber's car door slam behind him, and Louise called out a friendly hello. Hopefully, once she was chatting with her girlfriends, Amber would snap out of it and concentrate instead on having a good time. Here are the others now. Joe inclined his head toward the sound of tires on gravel at the head of the parking lot. Perfect timing. Whereabouts is this fishing spot? How long will it take us to get there? Mike took their backpacks from the trunk and hung his own from one shoulder, leaning Amber's pack up against the rear tire. An hour and a half or so, maybe a little more. Depends on how fast we can hike. Ed reckons we're guaranteed to catch something. He said he pulled a 12-pounder out of the river the last time he was there. Nice. Adam rolled his work truck into a park on the other side of Joe's truck. Travis Construction was professionally sign-written across it in blue paint, although most of the words were hidden beneath a thick layer of dust and grime. He had his window wound down and his loud yippee-yay, as he switched off the engine, echoed around the lot. Which way are we headed? Mike spun in a slow circle, looking around. There were several hiking trails leading off from the parking bay, and he'd walked most of the circular trails over the years, the ones that weaved away through the trees for varying distances and eventually brought the weary but satisfied hiker back to his vehicle. South Knoll. Ed said we have to keep to the middle path when we reach the three-way, and then we have to keep going until we reach the second fork. He was bent over now, fiddling with the zips and pockets on one of the backpacks. Mike nodded. The South Knoll Trail was in one of the circular tracks and it didn't include a winding walk up to a lookout, therefore it wasn't as popular. He could read the words on the green forestry sign from here, South Knoll Trail. Day hike. Moderate fitness levels required. Take only photographs and leave only footprints. The words were accompanied by a meandering map, showing the trail splitting into three prongs a short distance along with the right path highlighted as the route that would lead back to join the main trail, the one that would take the hiker to the pointed knob of North Knoll Peak and the North Knoll Lookout. Adam was clattering around in the back of his truck and Mike went over to speak him. "Hi Mike." Sandy bustled busily past with her backpack swinging from her hands, making a beeline over to where Louise and Amber were now standing talking by the guardrail. "Hey Sandy." Mike leaned his hip against the sun-warmed, dusty side of the truck and inhaled the fresh scent of pine trees that pervaded the air. "Did you drive through that weird swarm of insects hanging across the highway a few miles back?" Adam frowned at him as he dragged his backpack across the metal base of the tray. "Strangest thing I've ever seen." "Nope. Didn't see anything like that and we only got here a few minutes ahead of you. Joe and Louise were the first here. Take a look at my front windscreen." Mike dutifully tramped around to the front of the truck to inspect the windscreen. It was as dusty as the rest of the truck, but on top of that, there were several large bug splatters on the glass along with a bunch of beige-colored insect wings trapped under the windscreen wipers. Adam walked up beside him. "I think they were moths of some kind, but you don't generally find a bunch of moths swarming around in the middle of the day." "Field butterflies?" Mike wasn't too interested in a random swarm of bugs, not now that they were here and the campsite and fishing spot were just a few hours walking distance away from where they now stood. "Yeah, maybe, but they were making a weird noise and I've never heard butterflies make any sort of noise." "I don't think they can." Adam's face crinkled with disgust as he pulled one of the wipers away from the windscreen and flicked the mangled dead bodies off the rubber blade with his thumb. "It was odd. 1 minute they were there, almost entirely covering our view, and then they were gone again. Maybe I'll ask the bug exterminator about them the next time I see him." "The bug exterminator?" "Yeah. Sandy has been complaining about spiders and stuff in the house for weeks. The bug guy came round just as we were leaving. The house is going to empty all weekend. It makes sense to have the treatment done while everyone is away. That shit's toxic and we don't need the kids breathing it in." Mike pushed himself away from the truck, his mind now firmly on the hike. "I'll go tell the girls we're ready to go. I've got a few new lures that I want to try out once we get to the river." Adam grinned. "I've got dibs on the first trout, so don't go getting ahead of yourself." Mike started back to help Amber with her backpack, but she'd already put it on and was waiting with Sandy and Louise by the South Knoll sign. He whistled to himself as he grabbed his fishing rod from the trunk and locked the SUV doors. It was time to get this party started. They had passed the first fork over an hour ago and were far enough into the woods for the noise of the highway to be disguised by birdsong and the low, busy hum of insects. Mike felt himself sinking into the ambience of their surroundings. He was enjoying the walk despite the rough rub of the top of the backpack on the back of his neck and the annoyingly lumpy something prodding into his shoulder blade from inside the bag. Amber's mood had regained its buoyancy after meeting up with her friends and she was walking a short distance behind the men with Sandy and Louise, all three women deep in conversation. Her carefree laugh drifted through the air to reach his ears and he smiled to himself. It was going to be a good few days, just to break away from everything that they needed. "Have you been to this spot before, Joe?" Adam was heavily laden down with a World Expedition-sized backpack, a squat and chubby cooler bag, an extra-long fishing rod, and a large, wooden-handled trout net, but he hadn't given one murmur of complaint about his burden. Adam the mountain man was in his element out here in the forest and he hadn't stopped smiling since they left the parking lot. No, but Ed couldn't stop talking about it. He said it's far enough in for most people not to bother with the walk and the fish are less cautious and wary than they are in the more populated areas. Mike, who was walking a couple of steps in front of the others, came to halt as he rounded the bend. "There's the fork in the path. Which path are we meant to take now?" "Shit. Joe stopped and slapped his palm against his forehead. Ed didn't mention which fork to take once we reached this point, and I forgot to ask. The girls had caught up with them now, and Mike watched as Amber bent to slap at an insect on her calf. He hoped it wasn't a mosquito. He didn't want to listen to her grumble all night about her itchy bites, not when this was meant to a relaxing and peaceful weekend for everyone. The river is over there. Adam used the trout net to gesture vaguely to the left. I know we've taken lots of twists and turns already, but you said the campsite is near the river. I reckon it's that way, unless there's another fork further ahead that will lead us back in that direction. Joe scratched his head. I don't think there's another one. Ed didn't say anything about a third fork. Are we going left or right? Make up your mind, but get it right the first time. We could go down the wrong one and it turns out to be a dead end, Sandy said bossily. And then we'll just have to retrace our steps, which we don't need. Neither of these trails look like they've been used much. Most people take the South Knoll trail or go to one of the picnic spots off Highway 12. Are you sure you can't remember the directions, Joe? Sandy, overweight and red-faced, was puffing despite the relative ease of the hike so far. They hadn't come across many steep inclines yet, and as Mike had never been this far down this way, he wasn't sure if they would. The path had remained fairly level, save for a few shallow dips and rises here and there. I'm sure Ed didn't say anything about which fork we're meant to take, Joe said again. He caught the looks everyone was now directing at him and injected a little more confidence into his tone. I agree with Adam. Let's stick to the left path and head towards the river. You can't go wrong if you head for the river. Are you sure about that, Joe? His wife looked at him dubiously. You know your sense of direction isn't the best. Why didn't you ask Ed to write it down? What is it with you men and your inability to admit that you don't know everything? Mike walked a short way along the overgrown path on the right while the others discussed and bickered over their options. He wasn't as close to Joe as he was to Adam, but he liked the man and he did call him a friend. However, he had noticed that he could be easily distracted at times, as if his head was too filled with other thoughts to allow any new ones to enter. He walked a little further, his feet crunching across the twigs and dead leaves that lined the path. The track was narrower here, crowded in on both sides by dense, uneven rows of pine and red maple trees and thin, looping vines that snaked their way across the path, and the light was dim due to the unbroken ceiling of branches, pine needles, and leaves above his head. Sandy was right, it didn't look like the kind of trail that people use too often, but then neither did the other fork. He tipped his head back and peered up at the tiny pinpricks of sunlight and sky that he could see far above. It was colder here too, chilly and damp despite the fact there had been very little rain for weeks. He cocked his head, listening as another noise became apparent above the tuneful songs of the birds and the low buzzing of the bugs. A high-pitched chirping or squeaking sound had now overlaid everything else, and it seemed to be moving closer. Mike! He spun around to see Adam beckoning at him with the trout net from back near the fork. Come on, happy wanderer. It's unanimous, we're going left. Coming. He stayed where he was for a few seconds longer, trying to pinpoint the source of the chirping, but the birdsong had taken over the forest once more. He hitched his backpack up a little higher and strode back down the trail to catch up with the others. 20 or 30 minutes later, the path they were following widened before opening out into a small clearing. The silvery, glittering expanse of the river could be glimpsed through the trees, and there was a blackened ring of stones and old ash in the middle of the clearing, a sign that someone else had made camp here before them. Mike gratefully slipped his arms out of his backpack straps and allowed it to drop down to the ground. That sucker had seemed to grow bulkier and heavier with each step he took. Amber glowered at him. She dragged her face down into the petulant frown as soon as she saw the campsite. Is this it? We've walked all this way for a patch of brown grass and a circle of trees? Are you freaking kidding me? He bent to kiss the pout from her lips, but she quickly turned her head aside, causing his mouth to collide with her hair. Don't. I'm all hot and sweaty. This is great, isn't it? Told you it would be great, crowed Joe, reaching for accolades after the little blip back at the fork. This is exactly as Ed described it. It's great, Adam agreed happily. He tossed his backpack, his fishing rod, and the trout net to one side and stooped to pop open the cooler. I don't know about anyone else, but I'm ready for a beer. I'm pooped. Sandy sat clumsily down on the grass and tipped herself backwards, lying spread-eagled across the ground with her plump legs and arms spread wide. Someone wake me up when it's lunchtime. Louise sat her hands on her hips and studied the area critically, assessing their surroundings with the eye of an accomplished camper. We should put up our tents under those trees over there. We'll want some shelter if a band of rain does come through. The weather forecast said we might get a shower or two tomorrow evening. Mike tried to catch Amber's eye and coax a smile from her, but she kept her head turned and refused to look at him. He shrugged and left her to it, accepting Adam's offer of a beer before wandering across with him and Joe to look at the river. The McLaren was a popular fishing river, full of alternating patches of shallow rapids and deep, still pools along the many miles of waterways. Many prize-winning trout or salmon had been pulled from her crystal-clear waters, but she wasn't an easy mistress. The river was prone to flash flooding and she had taken her fair share of unwary fishermen and inexperienced hikers down into her forbidding depths, some never to resurface. However, today beneath the cloudless sky the river sparkled and danced, entrancing and enchanting anyone lucky enough to be here. Joe belched and pointed his beer can upstream. Ed said it's best to head up that way. Apparently, there's a couple of decent-sized pools just around the bend. Adam picked up a smooth pebble and skimmed it across the surface of the river and the men watched as it skipped 7 times before sinking into the water. 7's a charm, Adam said smugly. My lucky number. Bodes well for a good weekend. Mike looked back towards the clearing. The girls were standing together now, and Louise was still pointing at the trees and giving directions. Once the tents were up and camp was made, Amber would relax again and hopefully she would stay that way for the rest of the weekend. He didn't want to spend the entire trip fending off her bad moods or watching what he said. Might go back and set up the tent, he said casually. Keep the girls happy. Leave them to it, Joe grunted with the effort as he pulled back his arm and flung a stone at the river. He had grabbed a handful of pebbles and was now trying to beat Adam's 7 skips, although his first attempt failed miserably and ended in a feeble plop. No rush. We're all here to enjoy ourselves. Schedules and timetables and keeping the women happy are out the window for the next few days.